I spent 10 years cleaning up my alcoholic father's vomit and forging his signature to keep us housed. After he killed a mother of 3 driving drunk, he got sober for the first time ever. Not to make amends, but to build a legal case that I was the real villain who'd enabled him to death and prevented his recovery. I was 7 when I learned the difference between regular tired and hammered tired. Regular tired meant Dad would eat dinner and fall asleep watching TV. Hammered tired meant I'd find him face down in his own vomit at 3 a.m. The first time I cleaned it up, I used paper towels and Lysol. My hands shook the entire time. By the time I turned 12, I had a system. Rubber gloves under the sink, enzyme cleaner for the carpet, and a change of clothes ready. I'd roll him onto his side and put a trash can next to him. Then I'd set 3 alarms to check on him through the night. Mom left when I was 9. She kissed my forehead one Tuesday morning and never came back. Her note under the coffee maker said she couldn't watch him unalive himself anymore. Someone had to take care of him though. He was still my dad. By 14, I perfected his signature. Permission slips, absence notes, and checks flowed from my pen like water. I'd deepen my voice and call his boss, claiming food poisoning or the flu. They bought it every time. Nobody questions a sick day when you've built trust over years. The bills required more creativity. I opened a checking account online using his information. Every 2 weeks, I'd intercept his direct deposit and pay everything before he could drink it away. Rent, utilities, groceries, whatever was left went into a coffee can behind the water heater. Emergency money for the really bad nights. I told myself it was temporary. He'd get better. He'd realize what he was doing. But addiction doesn't care about your optimism or your hope. Junior year changed everything. Dad discovered the coffee can and threw it at my head. $700 scattered across the kitchen floor while he called me a manipulative thief. Just like my mother, he said. I gathered the bills while he stumbled to his truck. I should have taken his keys. I should have called someone. I did nothing. He returned with a case of beer and an apology. We both knew he was lying, but I helped him to bed anyway. That's what I did. I helped. I enabled. I couldn't see the difference anymore. The night it happened, I was studying chemistry at a friend's house. My phone rang at 9:47 p.m. The next hour blurred into fragments. Police station, fluorescent lights, burnt coffee smell, a dead mother, 3 motherless children, my father's accident. But the worst part came 72 hours later. I was sitting in our living room when the doorbell rang. 2 lawyers in expensive suits stood on our porch. Dad had hired them with money I didn't know he had. They pushed past me with recording devices and notepads. Everything I'd done to protect him became evidence of my crimes. The medication tracking chart showed I'd been practicing medicine without a license. The forged signatures proved fraud. The hidden money demonstrated financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Dad sat in his recliner, sober for the first time in months. He'd prepared a statement about how I'd prevented his recovery, how I'd isolated him from help, how I'd enjoyed the control too much to let him get better. The lawyers nodded sympathetically as he spoke. They'd already built their narrative. A controlling child who preferred managing an addict to losing power. A teenager who played God with someone's life. A minor who made adult decisions that led to vehicular manslaughter. They had text messages where I'd promised to handle everything. Bank statements showing unauthorized access. Voice recordings of me impersonating him to his employer. Years of evidence I'd created while thinking I was helping. The truth was even worse than their story. I had enabled him. Every mess I cleaned taught him he didn't need to face consequences. Every lie I told gave him permission to tell more. Every bill I paid freed up more money for alcohol. I'd removed all the natural barriers that might have forced him to confront his addiction. A mother was dead because I'd been too proud to admit I couldn't fix this alone. 3 children would grow up without her because I'd thought love meant protecting someone from themselves. The lawyers explained how the case would proceed. Child Protective Services would investigate our home. Criminal charges were possible for the forgery and fraud. The family of the victims could sue us both. Dad would claim diminished capacity due to alcoholism I'd hidden from everyone who could have helped. They left their business cards and a court summons. Dad walked them to the door like a gracious host. When he turned back to me, his eyes were clear and cold. He believed his own story now. The blackouts had given him permission to rewrite history. In his version, I was the villain who'd stolen his chance at recovery. The truth was negotiable when you couldn't remember it. I sat in the wreckage of our living room, holding the court summons. 17 years old and facing fraud charges. My father finally sober because he needed to destroy me coherently. A family destroyed because I'd confused enabling with love. The next morning, I packed a bag. Not to run away, but to gather everything I'd need for what was coming. Every receipt I'd saved, every text message screenshot, every voice recording I'd made when Dad was too hammered to remember his threats. 3 years of documentation filled 2 shoeboxes. Dad emerged from his bedroom at noon, wearing the same clothes from yesterday. He moved through the kitchen like he owned it again, making coffee with steady hands. The tremors that usually shook his fingers had vanished. Sobriety suited him when he needed it to. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and started writing. Lists of my supposed crimes, dates and times I'd sabotaged his recovery attempts. Each lie crafted with the precision of someone who finally had a clear head and a target. I watched from the doorway as he worked. This was the father I'd glimpsed occasionally over the years. The one who could have been brilliant if alcohol hadn't claimed him. Now that brilliance focused entirely on destroying me. The doorbell rang again. This time, a social worker stood outside. Young, maybe 25, with a practiced smile and a clipboard. Dad invited her in like an old friend. She toured our house while Dad narrated. He showed her the hidden coffee can, now empty. Explained how I'd controlled the finances to keep him dependent. Pointed out the medication chart on the refrigerator as evidence of my unauthorized medical decisions. I followed them silently, watching her take notes. She photographed everything. The rubber gloves under the sink became evidence of my obsessive control. The enzyme cleaner proved I'd been covering up his condition. When she interviewed me separately, I could see the conclusion already already forming in her eyes. A controlling teenager who'd prevented an adult from seeking proper help. The narrative was clean, simple, believable. After she left, Dad returned to his legal pad. He'd scheduled meetings with his employer, explaining how I'd impersonated him, how I'd hidden his illness when they could have helped, how company resources for addiction treatment had gone unused because of my interference. The house felt different with him sober, quieter, but not peaceful, more like the held breath before a scream. I'd grown so used to managing chaos that this calculated destruction felt worse. That evening, Dad's brother arrived. Uncle Robert hadn't visited in 2 years, but Dad had called him with his version of events. They sat at the kitchen table, and I listened from the hallway as Dad spun his story. Robert nodded along, occasionally glancing toward where I hid. He'd seen Dad hammered at family gatherings. He'd watched Mom leave, but the sober man in front of him was convincing. Victims often protect their abusers, Dad explained. I'd been traumatized by Mom's abandonment and channeled it into controlling him. The next 3 days followed the same pattern. Dad made phone calls, scheduled meetings, built his case. Each conversation refined his story. He learned which details sparked sympathy, which accusations carried the most weight. I spent those days organizing my evidence. Bank statements showing Dad's paycheck disappearing at liquor stores before I'd intervened. Photos of him passed out in dangerous positions. Emergency room records from alcohol poisoning incidents. But for every piece of evidence I had, Dad had a counter-narrative. The bank statements showed financial abuse. The photos were staged to humiliate him. The ER visits happened because I'd hidden his condition from professionals who could have helped. On the 4th day, Dad's boss came by. Mr. Peterson had employed Dad for 15 years. He sat uncomfortably on our couch while Dad explained how I'd impersonated him on sick calls, how I'd prevented him from using the company's employee assistance program. Mr. Peterson's face went through several expressions: surprise, disappointment, something that might have been recognition. He'd suspected something was wrong but hadn't pushed. Now Dad gave him an explanation that absolved everyone except me. After Mr. Peterson left, Dad made more calls. Each person he spoke to became another witness to my supposed crimes. The neighbor who'd seen me buying groceries with Dad's credit card, the pharmacist who'd watched me pick up his medications, the bank teller who'd processed the account I'd opened. Everyone had seen pieces of the truth, but Dad arranged those pieces into a different picture: a controlling child systematically isolating an adult from help, a teenager playing parent while preventing real intervention. The victim's family hired an investigator. He came by on day 5, a quiet man who took photos of our driveway, measured skid marks that had already faded. Dad walked him through that night, how I'd supposedly hidden his keys in places he couldn't find them, forcing him to use his spare set. I wanted to scream that there were no hidden keys, that Dad kept spares magnetic attached under his truck because he lost them so often when hammered. But who would believe me now? So the kid spent years cleaning up vomit and paying bills while Dad drank himself stupid. And now that there's a dead mother involved, suddenly Dad's stone cold sober and building a case against the teenager? Dad's sobriety held steady. No shakes, no sweats, no sneaking drinks. He attended his first AA meeting and returned with a sponsor who'd heard his version of events. Another witness to add to his collection. The sponsor, an older woman named Victoria, came for dinner. Dad cooked for the first time in years, hands steady as he chopped vegetables. They discussed the 12 steps while I sat silent at the table. Victoria talked about making amends, taking responsibility. Dad nodded earnestly, explaining how he wanted to make things right, how he needed to protect other families from what had happened to those 3 children. After she left, Dad returned to his legal pad. He'd started a timeline of my enabling behaviors, every forged signature dated, every sick call documented, every bill I'd paid without permission recorded. The lawyers returned on day 6 with more paperwork, depositions to schedule, evidence to review. They'd found a precedent case where a minor had been charged with elder abuse for similar actions. The conviction had stuck. They explained how my actions met the legal definition of financial exploitation, how forging signatures constituted identity theft, how impersonating Dad to his employer was fraud. Each charge carried potential juvenile detention time. Dad sat through the meeting like a concerned parent. He asked about rehabilitation programs for controlling behavior, mentioned counseling he thought might help me, playing the role of a father who wanted what was best for his troubled child. That night, I heard him on the phone with Mom's sister. Aunt Sarah had stayed neutral when Mom left, but Dad was working on her too, explaining how Mom's abandonment had damaged me, how I'd never processed it properly, how it had manifested in this need to control. By the end of the week, Dad had built an entire support network. People who believed his story because it was easier than believing the alternative, that they'd all failed to notice or help when it mattered. The court summons date approached. Dad stayed sober, attended meetings, met with lawyers. He transformed into the father I'd always wanted, except this version existed solely to destroy me. I found myself wondering if this was how Mom felt before she left, watching someone rewrite reality until you questioned your own memories, seeing the truth twisted into something unrecognizable but believable. The shoeboxes of evidence felt heavier each day, proof that might not matter against Dad's newfound clarity and growing list of witnesses. He'd turned my every act of love into a crime, my every attempt to help into harm. On the final night before court, Dad sat in his recliner reviewing his statement, sober, focused, prepared, the father who could have existed all along if I hadn't enabled his disease, or so his story went. I understood then what the lawyers had seen immediately. The truth was complicated, messy, hard to explain. Dad's lie was simple, clean, easy to believe. A controlling child, a prevented recovery, a tragic accident that could have been avoided. The real tragedy was that part of his story was true. I had enabled him. I had prevented consequences. I had made decisions that weren't mine to make, but I'd done it from love, not control, from desperation, not manipulation. That distinction wouldn't matter in court. The results were the same. A mother dead, 3 children orphaned, a father finally sober when it was too late to matter. I sat with my shoeboxes of evidence, knowing they might not be enough. Dad had turned my protection into prosecution, my care into crime. The same hands that had cleaned his vomit would now be painted as the hands that had held him down. Tomorrow, we'd enter a courtroom where truth was negotiable and love could be reframed as abuse, where a 17-year-old's attempts to save a parent would be dissected by people who'd never found their father face down at 3 a.m. Dad finished reviewing his statement and looked at me. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold certainty of his new truth. The story he'd built was perfect. I was the villain who'd stolen his chances. He was the victim who'd finally found strength. The 3 children and their dead mother were casualties of my control. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time Dad had been sober this long. Never, I realized. It had never happened before. It took destroying me to save himself. The irony tasted bitter. All those years of wanting him to get better, and he finally had. Not for himself, not for me, but for revenge crafted so carefully it looked like justice. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight, I sat in our living room, surrounded by evidence of love that looked like crime, protection that appeared as control, help that had become harm. The morning arrived with frost on the windows, and Dad already dressed in his best suit. He'd ironed it himself, something I hadn't seen him do in years. His movements were deliberate, practiced. He'd been rehearsing this performance for days. I dressed in my only formal clothes, hands steady despite the churning in my stomach. The shoeboxes of evidence sat by the door, waiting. Dad glanced at them and smiled. Not his hammered smile or his apologetic smile. This was something new, confidence mixed with contempt. The drive to the courthouse took 20 minutes. Dad drove his truck while I followed in Mom's old car that I'd kept running. He'd insisted we arrive separately, part of his narrative about my controlling behavior, how I'd isolated him even from simple things like riding together. Inside the courthouse, Dad's lawyers waited in the lobby. They'd multiplied. 3 suits now instead of 2, plus a young woman with a tablet who documented everything. Dad shook their hands like old friends while I stood apart, clutching my boxes. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Wood paneling, uncomfortable benches, a judge's bench that loomed over everything. The victim's family sat on one side, 3 children, the oldest maybe 12, flanked by grandparents whose eyes held a grief I recognized. Dad took his seat with his legal team. They'd prepared visual aids, charts showing my pattern of control, timelines of his thwarted recovery attempts, everything professionally printed and mounted on boards. I sat alone on a bench behind them, my shoeboxes on the floor. No lawyer, no advocate, just a 17-year-old with receipts and recordings that suddenly seemed pathetic against their polished presentation. The judge entered, a woman in her 50s with gray streaking her hair. She reviewed the paperwork while the room held its breath. This wasn't a criminal trial, not yet. This was a hearing to determine if charges should be filed. Dad's lead lawyer stood first. He painted a picture with words. A father struggling with addiction, reaching for help, blocked at every turn by a child who needed to feel important. He used terms like parentification and codependent control. The visual aids came out. The medication chart I'd made to track Dad's prescriptions became evidence of unauthorized medical intervention. The calendar where I'd marked his sober days transformed into proof of obsessive monitoring. Dad took the stand. His voice was clear, steady, apologetic. He spoke about wanting to get help but finding his keys hidden, about trying to call his employer but discovering I'd already called in sick for him, about the shame of having his child control his finances. He cried at exactly the right moments. When he mentioned the victims, his voice broke perfectly. When he described discovering I'd been forging his signature for years, his hands trembled with just enough emotion to seem genuine. The judge asked him questions. Dad had answers for everything. Why hadn't he sought help earlier? Because I'd convinced him he didn't need it. Why hadn't he reported the forgeries? Because he loved me and hoped I'd stop on my own. When they showed the bank statements, Dad explained how I'd intercepted his paychecks before he could use them for therapy. When they presented the forged signatures, he described feeling violated but too ashamed to act. My turn came after lunch. No lawyer to guide me, just the judge asking if I had anything to say. I stood with my shoeboxes, voice cracking as I tried to explain. I pulled out the photos first. Dad passed out in his own vomit. Dad unconscious on the bathroom floor. Dad's truck wrapped around a mailbox from a previous hammered driving incident. The judge looked at each one without expression. I showed the receipts. Liquor store purchases using the money I hadn't managed to intercept. Bar tabs that emptied our account in single nights. The judge nodded but said nothing. The recordings were harder. Dad's slurred voice threatening to unalive himself if I called anyone. Dad sobbing apologies while promising to get better if I just helped him one more time. Dad raging about Mom leaving, blaming me for not being enough to make him stop drinking. But for every piece of evidence I presented, Dad's lawyers had a response. The photos? I'd taken them to humiliate him. The receipts? Proof I'd been monitoring his purchases obsessively. The recordings? Evidence I'd been documenting his lowest moments instead of getting him help. The judge asked me why I hadn't called social services, why I hadn't told a teacher, why I hadn't reached out to extended family. Each question felt like an accusation. I tried to explain the fear, the certainty that foster care would be worse, the hope that each promise to get better might be real, the love that made me believe I could fix this myself. But my explanations sounded weak against Dad's polished narrative. I was just a teenager stammering through tears while he was a recovered adult, taking responsibility for his actions. The victim's family spoke next. Dad's building quite the show here, isn't he? 20 witnesses and visual aids while the kid sits alone with cardboard boxes. I'm curious why nobody questions how a man who couldn't hold a job suddenly organized this perfect legal presentation in just days. The grandmother's voice was steady as she described her daughter, a nurse who'd worked double shifts to support her children, a woman who'd been driving home from her second job when when Dad's truck crossed the center line. The children didn't speak. They just sat there, the youngest clutching a stuffed animal, all three wearing clothes that were clean but worn, faces that would grow up shaped by this loss. The grandmother didn't blame me directly, but she spoke about accountability, about the systems that failed, about the enabling that allowed a hammered driver to keep his keys. Her words were careful, but the message was clear. Dad wiped his eyes as she spoke. His lawyers took notes. I sat frozen, watching three children who'd lost their mother because I'd thought I could manage an unmanageable situation. The hearing recessed. Dad left with his lawyers, discussing strategy in low voices. I sat alone in the hallway, shoeboxes at my feet, watching people pass by on their way to other courtrooms, other tragedies. A woman approached me. She introduced herself as a social worker, different from the one who'd visited our house. She spoke about emergency placement, about safety plans, about the investigation that would follow regardless of the judge's decision. I nodded without really listening. Through the window, I could see Dad in the parking lot, laughing with his lawyers. Sober Dad was charming, convincing. Everything I'd wanted him to be, weaponized against me. The afternoon session focused on the financial aspects. Dad's lawyers presented bank records showing patterns of unauthorized access. They'd found instances where I'd moved money between accounts, paid bills without permission, hidden funds from the account owner. Each transaction had a story. The rent payment I'd made while Dad was on a 3-day bender. The electricity bill I'd paid to keep our power on. The grocery money I'd protected from becoming whiskey money. But stripped of context, reduced to numbers on a screen, it looked like theft. A minor accessing an adult's accounts, transferring funds without authorization, creating hidden reserves without consent. Dad testified about discovering the coffee can. His voice broke as he described the betrayal of finding money hidden in his own home. Money that could have gone to treatment, he said. Money that could have changed everything. I wanted to scream that he'd known about the coffee can for months, that he'd dipped into it himself when desperate, that the $700 he'd thrown at my head had been accumulated over years of small savings. But who would believe me? Dad was sober, articulate, remorseful. I was emotional, defensive, obviously guilty of the technical crimes they'd outlined. The judge asked about the forgeries. Dad's lawyers presented examples. Permission slips for school trips, absence notes when I'd been too exhausted to attend class, checks for school supplies and fees. Each signature was clearly not Dad's. My attempts at matching his handwriting looked amateur under scrutiny. The lawyers had even brought in a handwriting expert who testified about the obvious differences. Dad expressed shock at the extent of it. He'd had no idea, he claimed. He'd trusted me to bring him things to sign. To discover I'd been forging his name for years felt like a fundamental breach of trust. The employment fraud was presented next. Recordings of me calling in sick for Dad, deepening my voice to sound older. The lawyers played each one, highlighting the deception, the practiced nature of the lies. Dad's boss, Mr. Peterson, had provided a statement. He felt betrayed, manipulated. He'd offered help numerous times, only to be told everything was fine. Resources that could have made a difference had gone unused because of my interference. By the time they finished, I looked like a master manipulator, a child who'd systematically isolated an adult from help, controlled his finances, forged his signature, and impersonated him to maintain power. The truth was more complicated but harder to prove. Every action had been reactive, not planned. Every lie had been desperate, not calculated. Every forgery had been survival, not control. But complexity doesn't play well in courtrooms. Dad's simple narrative of a controlling child made more sense than my messy truth of love and fear and desperation and enabling. As the day wore on, more witnesses appeared via statements. The pharmacist who'd always wondered why a teenager picked up prescriptions, the bank teller who'd processed the account opening, the neighbor who'd seen me cleaning up Dad's messes. Each statement supported Dad's version, a child taking on adult responsibilities, a teenager preventing proper intervention, a minor making decisions that led to tragedy. Dad's sobriety was emphasized repeatedly. 43 days sober now, attending meetings daily, working with his sponsor, taking responsibility for his actions while also acknowledging the systemic failures that enabled them. He'd even started volunteering to speak at schools about addiction, warning parents about the signs of enabling, educating teenagers about the difference between helping and harming, turning his tragedy into prevention. The judge listened to it all. She asked pointed questions, took extensive notes, showed no emotion that might hint at her thinking, professional distance while lives hung in the balance. As evening approached, the lawyers made their closing arguments. Dad's team painted me as a well-meaning but dangerous child who'd prevented recovery through control. They asked for understanding, for intervention, for systems to ensure this never happened again. They didn't explicitly call for my prosecution. They didn't need to. The evidence they'd presented made the case for them. Financial fraud, forgery, impersonation, crimes with clear victims and documented proof. My closing argument was simpler. I stood with my shoeboxes, 17 years old and exhausted, and told the truth. I'd done everything wrong while trying to do something right. I'd enabled instead of helped. I'd protected instead of exposed. But I'd done it from love, not control. From fear, not power. From the desperate hope that if I just tried hard enough, I could keep my family together and my father alive. The judge thanked everyone and said she'd review the evidence. Her decision would come within the week. Court was adjourned with a bang of the gavel that felt like a period at the end of a sentence I couldn't rewrite. Outside, the victim's family waited by their car. The grandmother made eye contact with me, and in that moment, I saw what Dad's lawyers had been building toward. Not just my prosecution, but my position as the convenient scapegoat for a system that had failed everyone. Dad left with his lawyers, shaking hands and making plans. He'd done what he needed to do, presented himself as the victim, me as the perpetrator, the truth as negotiable. I drove home alone, shoeboxes in the back seat, knowing that everything was about to change. The house felt different when I arrived. Dad had already been there, packing things, preparing for whatever came next. On the kitchen table, he'd left a note. Not an apology or an explanation, just a list of things he'd need from his room if I was removed from the home. Practical to the end, even in his cruelty. I sat at that table where I'd done homework while monitoring his breathing, where I'd forged his signature on countless documents, where I'd counted and recounted money to make sure we could survive another month. The irony was perfect. Dad had finally gotten sober, but only to destroy me. He'd found clarity, but used it for revenge. He'd taken responsibility by ensuring I took the blame. Over the next days, I waited for the judge's decision while Dad continued his performance. He attended meetings, spoke at schools, met with the victim's family to express his remorse, building his new life on the foundation of my destruction. More people reached out with their versions of events. Teachers who'd noticed my exhaustion but never pressed. Relatives who'd suspected something but chosen distance over involvement. Everyone had a story about why they hadn't helped. Dad's narrative gave them all absolution. They hadn't failed to notice or act. They'd been prevented from helping by my controlling behavior. My isolation of Dad had extended to them, apparently. The social worker visited again, preparing paperwork for various outcomes. Foster care if I was removed from the home. Supervised release if charges were filed. Counseling regardless of what happened. She spoke kindly but professionally. She'd seen cases like this before, she said. Children who took on too much. Parents who shifted blame. Families destroyed by addiction and enabling and the inability to ask for help. But she'd never seen a parent weaponize sobriety quite like Dad had. That part, she admitted quietly, was new. The calculation of it, the precision, the way he'd turned recovery into revenge. Dad continued his schedule. Meetings in the morning, volunteer work in the afternoon, phone calls with lawyers in the evening. He'd even started journaling, documenting his recovery journey. I found pages of it left out, probably intentionally. His version of our history, written with the clarity of sobriety and the revision of blame. In his journal, every drink had been enabled, every failure had been facilitated, every chance at recovery had been sabotaged. He wrote about the accident with particular detail, how he'd searched for his keys, finding them in unusual places, how he'd felt forced to use the spare set, how he'd driven that night not fully understanding his impairment because I'd hidden the extent of his drinking from everyone. The lies were so smooth they almost sounded like truth. Even I found myself wondering if maybe I had hidden keys without remembering, if maybe I had sabotaged his recovery without realizing. The grandmother's careful words about enabling feel like they're carrying more weight than just grief. There's something calculated in how she's framing this whole situation right now. Dad's tears while his lawyers take notes? Gaslighting works best when the victim already carries guilt. More evidence surfaced as Dad's lawyers continued their investigation. They found the online account I'd created to manage bills, tracked the IP address to our home computer, documented every login, every transaction, every unauthorized access. They interviewed my teachers, who confirmed my exhaustion and declining grades. Proof, they said, that I'd been overwhelmed by responsibilities I'd insisted on taking. Evidence that the situation had been unsustainable. They even found my internet search history. Queries about addiction, about enabling, about how to help someone who didn't want help. Searches that showed I'd known what I was doing was wrong, but continued anyway. Dad used these discoveries in his talks at schools. Warning signs, he called them. Red flags that parents should watch for. Children who took on too much, who enabled instead of seeking help, who thought love meant protection from consequences. He was becoming a small-town expert on addiction and enabling. The father who'd lost everything to addiction and a child's misguided help. The cautionary tale that made people feel better about their own failures to act. The victim's family filed a civil suit, not against me directly, but against Dad, with my enabling behavior listed as a contributing factor. Their lawyer contacted me, wanting to know if I'd testify about Dad's drinking patterns. But testifying would mean admitting to the forgeries, the fraud, the years of deception. It would mean providing evidence for my own prosecution. The trap was perfect. Truth would convict me. Silence would protect Dad. Dad's sponsor, Victoria, reached out to me privately. She'd been in recovery for 15 years, she said. She'd seen a lot of manipulation in her time. She knew what accountability looked like, and this wasn't it. But she couldn't say that publicly. Sponsorship was sacred. Dad's recovery, however motivated, was still recovery. She could only offer me her private doubts and the suggestion that I find my own support system. I started attending Al-Anon meetings in the next town over, sitting in circles with other family members of addicts, listening to stories that echoed mine, the enabling, the guilt, the impossible choices between help and harm. But even there, Dad's narrative followed me. Word had spread about the accident, the investigation, the enabling that had led to tragedy. Other members looked at me with a mixture of sympathy and warning. I was what happened when helping went too far. The judge's decision arrived on a Thursday, a thick envelope delivered by courier, requiring signature. Dad was at a meeting, so I signed for it with hands that barely shook anymore. Inside, pages of legal language outlined my future. The judge had found sufficient evidence of financial fraud and forgery to recommend charges, but given my age and circumstances, she was deferring to juvenile court for final determination. The custody portion was clearer. I would remain in the home under supervision. Weekly check-ins with social services, mandatory counseling, no access to Dad's finances or personal documents. Essentially, forced boundaries that should have existed all along. Dad returned home to find me reading the decision. He read it over my shoulder, nodding at parts, frowning at others. When he finished, he went to make coffee, steady hands measuring grounds. We didn't speak about it directly. We'd moved past the need for confrontation. The legal system would handle everything now. Dad had won by making his sobriety contingent on my destruction, and we both knew it. The next weeks established our new routine. Dad maintained his sobriety with religious fervor, meetings, sponsorship, volunteer work, building a life that looked like recovery while feeling like revenge. I attended counseling sessions where therapists tried to untangle the knots of enabling and love and guilt and responsibility. They used terms like enmeshment and role reversal and traumatic bonding. But therapy couldn't change the facts. A mother was dead. 3 children were orphaned. I'd forged documents and accessed accounts and enabled addiction until it unalived someone. Understanding why didn't erase what. Dad's story evolved with each telling. The details that worked were emphasized. The parts that didn't were discarded. He became better at crying at the right moments, at expressing remorse that sounded genuine. He started writing a book about his experience. Enabled to Death, A Father's Journey Through Addiction and Misguided Love. Publishers were interested. His story had all the elements: tragedy, redemption, a cautionary tale for parents. I watched him work on it at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd done homework while monitoring his breathing. Now he typed his version of our history, revising reality with every keystroke. The civil suit moved forward. Depositions were scheduled. The victim's family wanted answers, accountability, someone to blame besides the system that had failed everyone. Dad positioned himself as fellow victim rather than perpetrator. His lawyers argued that his diminished capacity during addiction, combined with my enabling behavior, created a perfect storm of tragedy. No one person was to blame. Everyone was responsible. The settlement negotiations began. I continued finding evidence of Dad's calculated destruction. Notes he'd made before that first lawyer visit. Phone records showing calls to attorneys days before he'd confronted me. He'd planned this transformation, this weaponization of sobriety. But evidence of premeditation didn't matter anymore. Dad was sober. I was guilty of the technical crimes. The narrative was set. All that remained was playing out the consequences. My court date approached. Juvenile proceedings, closed to the public, but Dad would be there. The victim impact statements would be read. The evidence would be presented. A judge would decide if my attempts to save my father warranted criminal punishment. Dad prepared his own statement. I heard him practicing it, voice modulated for maximum impact. The pain of discovering my deceptions, the lost opportunities for recovery, the weight of knowing his addiction had been enabled to tragic ends. He'd become the father I'd always wanted, just not for me. Sober, articulate, responsible, using all the qualities I'd wished for as weapons against me, the cruelest irony in a story full of them. The night before court, I sat in my room surrounded by the remnants of my evidence. Photos, receipts, recordings, proof of a messier truth than the clean narrative Dad had crafted. Proof that might not matter. I thought about Mom, wherever she was. She'd escaped before the narrative could trap her, left before love could be reframed as abandonment, self-preservation as selfishness. She'd known what I was only now learning. Sometimes the only way to win was not to play, but I'd played for years, enabled for years, loved past the point of reason. Now the game was ending, and Dad had changed the rules to ensure his victory. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight, I sat with the truth that no one wanted to hear, that love could look like enabling, that help could cause harm, that sometimes sobriety came too late and for the wrong reasons. Dad's recovery was real. His 47 days were genuine, but they were built on the foundation of my destruction, maintained by the fuel of his revenge. He'd found the one motivation stronger than addiction, the need to make someone else pay. The juvenile court date arrived faster than expected. Dad wore his same suit, freshly pressed. I wore the only clean clothes that still fit. We drove separately again, maintaining his narrative about my controlling nature. The juvenile courtroom was different from the adult one. Smaller, more informal, with motivational posters on the walls. The judge was younger, maybe 40, with kind eyes that had seen too much. Dad's lawyers had prepared a modified presentation for juvenile court, less aggressive, more focused on rehabilitation. They emphasized my need for intervention, not punishment. Dad played the concerned father perfectly. The prosecutor reviewed the evidence of forgery and fraud, each instance documented, categorized, presented without emotion. My signatures on permission slips, the checking account I'd opened, the phone calls impersonating Dad. Dad testified again, this time focusing on his recovery journey. 53 days sober now. He spoke about forgiveness, about second chances, about wanting me to get the help I needed. His performance was flawless. My court-appointed attorney was fresh out of law school, overwhelmed by her caseload. She did her best with my shoeboxes of evidence, but Dad's lawyers had responses for everything. The photos showed obsessive documentation. The recordings proved violation of privacy. The social worker testified about our home visits. She described the supervised living arrangement, my compliance with counseling, Dad's continued sobriety. Everything looked like it was working exactly as intended. Victoria attended as a character witness for Dad. She spoke about his commitment to recovery, his honesty in meetings, his desire to help others avoid similar tragedies. She avoided eye contact with me the entire time. The victim's family submitted written statements. They wanted accountability but recognized my age. They asked for community service, counseling, anything that would acknowledge the harm while allowing for rehabilitation. The judge deliberated for less than an hour. When she returned, her expression was carefully neutral. She'd reviewed all evidence, considered all testimony, weighed the circumstances against the crimes. Her decision was measured, guilty of forgery and fraud, but with consideration for the circumstances. 2 years probation, 300 hours community service, continued counseling. Victoria shows up as Dad's character witness while avoiding eye contact. That detail speaks volumes about what everyone really knows here. She can't look at this kid while she praises Dad's recovery because she understands exactly what's happening in this courtroom right now. No access to anyone's financial accounts without supervision. Dad nodded solemnly as she spoke, playing the relieved father. His lawyers packed up their presentations, satisfied with the outcome. Justice had been served, the narrative preserved, the system had worked. After court, Dad waited by his truck. He had something to say, finally breaking our weeks of silence. He spoke about moving forward, about healing, about using this experience to help others. All the right words in all the right order. I nodded and walked to Mom's car. There was nothing left to say. He'd won everything he'd wanted: sobriety, sympathy, and my silence. The perfect victim story with the perfect villain to blame. The community service coordinator assigned me to the local food bank. 3 days a week, sorting donations and stocking shelves. The other volunteers were mostly retirees who'd heard some version of Dad's story. They watched me carefully at first, this dangerous child who'd enabled addiction. But gradually, as weeks passed, they saw what Dad's narrative couldn't capture. Just a tired teenager trying to make sense of loving someone who'd weaponized that love. Dad's book progressed rapidly. He gave readings at local bookstores, sharing his story of addiction and enablement. I'd hear about them secondhand, each retelling slightly different, each version moving further from truth. He started dating Victoria. It made sense in his new narrative. Two people in recovery, finding love through shared understanding. She moved in after 3 months, filling the house with recovery slogans and meditation music. I kept my head down, attended counseling, completed my service hours. The therapist was competent but overworked. We went through the motions of addressing my control issues and boundary violations. She knew the truth was more complex, but insurance only covered specific treatment plans. So we talked about healthy relationships and appropriate responsibilities while dancing around the reality of what had actually happened. Dad's speaking engagements expanded. Schools invited him to share his cautionary tale. Parent groups wanted to hear about warning signs. He became the face of recovery in our small town, the father who'd overcome addiction despite the obstacles. The civil suit settled out of court. Dad's insurance covered most of it, with a payment plan for the rest. He used it in his talks, evidence of taking responsibility, making amends, facing consequences. 6 months into my probation, Aunt Sarah reached out. She'd been thinking, she said, remembering things differently, the way Mom had looked before she left, the bruises she'd hidden, the fear in her eyes. We met at a coffee shop 2 towns over. She brought old photos, letters Mom had written but never sent, evidence of a different story, one where leaving was survival, not abandonment. But it was too late for alternative narratives. Dad's version had solidified into accepted truth. Aunt Sarah's memories were just that, memories. Unreliable, unprovable, dangerous to the established story. She offered to let me stay with her after probation ended, a chance to start over somewhere Dad's story hadn't reached. I thanked her but declined. Running would just confirm his narrative of my guilt. Dad's 1-year sobriety chip ceremony was a community event. The church basement was packed with supporters, fellow recovery members, people inspired by his journey. He gave a speech about redemption and responsibility. I attended because my probation officer required it, sat in the back row, watching Dad receive applause for overcoming the addiction I'd supposedly enabled. Victoria held his hand, tears in her eyes, the picture of recovery romance. After the ceremony, the victim's grandmother approached me. She'd been watching, she said, seeing how Dad's story had evolved, how the truth had been revised. She knew what gaslighting looked like. Her daughter had known too. She handed me an envelope. Inside, a letter her daughter had written years ago about seeing Dad hammered at a school event, about being concerned for his child, about wondering if she should call someone. Dated 2 years before the accident. Evidence that others had seen and done nothing. Proof that the enabling had been communal, not individual, but also proof that would never matter now. Dad's story was already written, published, accepted. My probation officer was pleased with my progress. I'd shown appropriate remorse, completed my requirements, attended every session. A model of rehabilitation, she wrote in her reports. The system working as intended. Dad started a nonprofit organization focused on preventing enabling. He secured grants, hired staff, developed programs. His personal tragedy transformed into professional purpose, built on the foundation of our family's destruction. I graduated high school quietly. No ceremony attendance, no celebration. Just picked up my diploma from the office and drove home. Dad was at a speaking engagement. Victoria left a congratulations card on the kitchen table. College wasn't an option. The criminal record, the financial reality, the weight of staying near enough to complete probation. I found work at a warehouse, night shifts that paid enough to save slowly. Dad's book released to modest success. Local newspapers ran features about his inspiring journey. He did radio interviews, podcast appearances, spreading his message about the dangers of enabling and the power of recovery. I read it once, in the bookstore. My character was two-dimensional, a cautionary tale about love becoming control. The mother who'd abandoned us was barely mentioned. The years of trying to survive were reduced to bullet points of dysfunction. The warehouse job was perfect in its mindlessness. Stack boxes, load trucks, clock out. No one there knew Dad's story. I was just another young person working nights to pay bills, invisible in the way I'd always wanted to be. One night, loading trucks in the rain, I found myself laughing. Not from humor, but from the absurdity. Dad had needed me to be the villain so badly he'd gotten sober to make it true. The ultimate enabling, giving him what he needed by becoming what he hated. Victoria got pregnant. Dad announced it at a recovery meeting I was required to attend. New life, new chances, proof that recovery brought rewards. The room erupted in congratulations while I sat frozen in the back row. They'd raised this child differently, he said, with boundaries and honesty and all the things I'd supposedly prevented. A do-over that required my erasure to make space for their redemption. My probation ended on a Tuesday. 2 years completed, all requirements met, the system satisfied. The officer stamped my papers and wished me well. Another success story for her files. I packed that night. Not much to take, just clothes and the few things that mattered. Left a note for Dad saying I was moving on, no forwarding address, clean and simple, like his narrative preferred. Aunt Sarah helped me find an apartment 3 states away. Small, cheap, anonymous. A place where Dad's story hadn't reached, where I could be just another person trying to figure out adult life. The first weeks weeks were hard. Nightmares about finding Dad face down, about the accident, about the courtroom, but gradually they faded, replaced by the strange peace of being unknown, unstudied, unnarrated. I found work at another warehouse, made friends who knew nothing about my past, built a life that was small but mine. No one to enable, no one to save, no one to blame for their choices. Sometimes I'd see Dad's book in stores, his face on the cover looking wise and weathered, the survivor who'd overcome, the father who'd found redemption, the story that required a villain to make sense. But I knew the truth, even if no one else did. Love could look like enabling, help could cause harm. Sometimes sobriety came too late and for the wrong reasons, and sometimes the only way to survive someone's recovery was to let them erase you from their story. Dad got his happy ending. Victoria, the new baby, the nonprofit, the speaking career, built on the foundation of making me the reason for his addiction, the barrier to his recovery, the tragedy that led to transformation. I got something different, not redemption or vindication, just the quiet freedom of being nobody's cautionary tale, the peace of loving someone from a distance they couldn't weaponize, the strange gift of being written out of a story I'd never asked to be part of. 3 years later, I was stocking shelves when my phone buzzed. An unknown number, a text that just said, "I remember the truth, Mom." I stared at it for a long moment, then deleted it. Some stories were better left unfinished, some truths better left unspoken, some love better left at the distance survival required. That night, I drove past a liquor store on my way home from work, saw a man stumbling to his car, keys in hand. I could have intervened, could have taken his keys, called someone, prevented whatever might happen next. Instead, I kept driving, not from cruelty or indifference, but from hard-won wisdom. Some people had to hit bottom on their own terms. Some consequences couldn't be prevented by love. Some help caused more harm than good. Dad had taught me that, in his twisted way. The greatest gift his sobriety gave me was the knowledge that I couldn't save anyone who didn't want saving. That enabling came in many forms, including believing I had the power to fix someone else's choices. I built my quiet life carefully. Small apartment, steady job, simple routines, no drama, no chaos, no one to save. The kind of boring existence Dad's story needed me to have never wanted. But in that simplicity, I found something Dad's narrative couldn't capture: peace. Not the dramatic redemption of recovery narratives, just the quiet peace of someone who'd learned the hardest lesson love could teach. Sometimes the most loving thing you could do was step back. Sometimes the greatest gift was refusing to be the reason someone else wouldn't save themselves. Sometimes freedom meant accepting that someone else's story required your erasure. Dad kept his sobriety, his new family, his nonprofit, his speaking career, all of it built on the story of overcoming my enabling. I kept my silence, my distance, my small anonymous life. Both of us got what we needed, even if neither got what we'd wanted. The truth lived in the space between his story and mine. Complicated, messy, resistant to clean narratives, but truth didn't matter when the story was already written, already believed, already serving its purpose. I learned to live with that, to find peace in being the villain of someone else's redemption, to build a life in the spaces his story couldn't reach, to love him from a distance that kept us both safe from what that love could become. Subscribe for more content on this channel. It makes me happy to see you guys comment on all the videos too.